All right, thank you everybody for coming this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce a good colleague and friend of mine, Liba, and I don't really want to give a huge background about her because it was on the abstract and information. I will tell you that I knew Liba over phone and email for many years and never met her, and it wasn't until I accidentally met her on a plane between Honolulu and the mainland with my family that was not seated together trying to find a seat to trade with, and it was Liba. And it was so funny that I ran into a person who I had talked with many times but had never met in person. In any case, over those intervening years since then, we've had many opportunities to meet in person and talk about a lot of issues related to conservation of wildlife and issues related to islands and invasive species and endangered species and some big restoration issues. And so I invited her here today to really present some big picture ideas related to Hawaii, and Hawaii is a great model system to talk about broader conservation issues.
Great, thank you, Chris. Well, good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks again to Chris and to the broader community here for inviting me to Auburn and hosting me here. So it's really a pleasure. I'm going to talk today a bit about my broader research program, and then in particular about some of the work that we've been doing in Hawaii over the last 15 years or so. So as an ecologist and conservation biologist, my passion is really curiosity for nature, but also finding ways to make conservation more commonplace by sustaining and aligning biodiversity and human well-being. And there's lots of different ways to achieve this goal, but one of them is to focus on working lands or private lands, and that's a lot of the work that my graduate students and I are doing. And you might ask, why private lands or why working lands? And although preserves are of course really important refuges for nature, we know that increasingly they're too small, too far apart, too isolated, and not resilient enough in the face of climate change and other global changes to protect the full suite of biodiversity over the long term. So I think a lot of the emerging opportunities in conservation science and practice are on private working lands, the places where people live and where they work. So I'm going to talk briefly about a few other projects that we're working on in my lab, sort of in this spirit of finding win-win opportunities for people and for nature. And one of those is around this concept of refaunation, or restoring species that maybe provided some critical ecological or cultural role in a landscape. And so there's two places where we're doing this. One is in northern Colorado, where I'm involved in a bison reintroduction project to the shortgrass steppe in northern Colorado. And we're asking, what are the social and ecological consequences of this reintroduction? So we're working with the community of people that interact in this landscape of public and private land, this mosaic of public and private land, and asking them on the social side, why do you visit the prairie? What do you think of when you think of grasslands and prairies? So what's your sort of sense of place associated with prairies? And we ask those sets of questions before bison reintroduced, and then now over the next several years post reintroduction. There's now 14 animals in this herd. And on the ecological side, we're looking at bird, mammal, and plant communities on bison grazed land, cattle grazed land, and ungrazed land to ask similar questions. When you restore a species like a bison to a shortgrass steppe that's otherwise been grazed by cattle, what are the consequences for natural communities? A second project that we're involved in is in western Colorado in apple orchards. So working with small organic farmers in apple orchards. And this is a place where these people are often very proud of the habitat that their orchards provide birds, but they're also concerned about that because birds consume fruit. They peck apples and peaches and cherries, and yet there's also some possibility or potential that the birds are providing an ecosystem service as well as a disservice, the damage in this system, by controlling pests, so by consuming pest insects. So we're looking at the net effects of birds in this system. So how well do these systems provide habitat for birds, and then what are the role of birds in orchards? To what extent are they providing ecosystem services and disservices to these small organic producers? And then the last other project I'll talk about here is a working group that I've had underway now for 5 years or so on what we're calling residential ecosystems. So how can we achieve conservation in places that are rapidly undergoing residential development? And this is certainly a big issue along the Front Range of Colorado, where I live, but also many other places around the country and the globe. And so we're seeking ways to sort of perhaps one strategy for doing this is through something called conservation development, where you cluster homes on a portion of a large property and preserve the rest, the most ecologically valuable portion of that property, in open space. We're looking at what are the ecological benefits, if any, of that strategy, what are the economic benefits to developers and to landowners, and to the broader community in terms of reduced infrastructure costs and things like that. Okay, so from there I want to go to Hawaii, and I'm talking about Hawaii today because this is a place where, again, I've worked for several decades, and I think also are a place where there's lots of potential for win-win opportunities for people and for nature. So I first started working in Hawaii, or got interested in Hawaii, when I was 19 years old as an undergraduate at a small college in Vermont, and I was getting summer field experiences. And immediately after my spring semester abroad in Nepal, I was scheduled to go straight to Hawaii and work on a field project there. The first time I'd ever work on a bird project on the Big Island of Hawaii. And while I was in Nepal, we were off for 2 months trekking in the Kanchenjunga region of Nepal, completely out of contact. The folks in Hawaii contacted my family, my home phone number, and said that the funding had been cut for the project. My mom, who's a very determined lady, said, you need to find something for her to do. This was just this internship anyways, $300 a month kind of job. She said, just find something for her to do. She's already going straight to Hawaii from Nepal. And so they, because she's so determined, they did find a place for me to work. I joined another project on Maui. Little did I know until I got there that this little sort of brownish, blackish, whitish bird that I'd be working on the po'uli was at the time one of the rarest birds in the world. Again, I'd never used a pair of binoculars before. So this is an adventure. We're working up in this natural area in Maui that's mostly only accessible by helicopter or a 14-mile hike across Haleakala Crater. Really dense, wet rainforest, really rare bird, only had been discovered in 1973. They knew almost nothing about it, including what it sounded like. So we just walked through the forest listening for something different at the time. And over the course of that summer, we did spot 5 individual, what we thought were 5 individual po'uli. And then I went back to Vermont, finished my undergraduate degree, went on and did a bunch of other jobs. In the meantime, I kept an eye on this project, and over the course of the next 10 years or so, what happened is that this population, this already very small population, declined to just a few individuals, and then just one individual, and then that species went extinct, as far as we know, in 2004. So this was my introduction to bird conservation, and what it made me want to do was go back to Hawaii and work with birds and in systems where there was still potential to perhaps change the trajectory. In this system, the population was so small that there was little chance of recovery, and that was compounded by a bunch of decisions that were probably made along the way. So now I want to step back and talk about some of this other work. So some of the focus of my earlier work in Hawaii was thinking about how can we conserve threatened species, like, for example, the po'uli, but also some of these other species on the other islands, while making conservation profitable. And then next I want to talk about sort of scaling that up and thinking about how can we reforest large systems on private and public land to benefit songbirds. And finally, how might birds themselves contribute to restoration or the regeneration of Hawaii's ecosystems? So why Hawaii? You may already be familiar with some of this from interacting with Chris, so I'm going to step through this relatively quickly. But I want to emphasize first these things, that this is just a spectacular place to work as an ecologist, and then talk a bit about these last 2 points as well, why there are some unique opportunities right now. So start by saying that Hawaii, like the Galapagos and other places, is a spectacular example of where adaptive radiations have occurred, where a few individuals, a small group of individuals have arrived and over thousands, millions of years have speciated dramatically. And in this case, the Hawaiian honey creepers have speciated into many different species that fill different foraging niches in the system. You can see nectivores, insectivores, seed eaters, in this picture. And it hasn't just been the birds, also the plants and the arthropods. This is, as far as we know, the only carnivorous caterpillar in the world. It's a caterpillar that eats flies, recently discovered in Hawaii. It's a place where you can see evolution in action. There's been some work that showed that this bird, the eevi, which classically fed on lobeliad flowers, which have long curved corollas, long curved petal structures that match their long curved bills, that as lobeliads have gotten increasingly rare in this system due to herbivory by non-native species, that the birds have actually switched to foraging almost entirely on ohia flowers, which have a really different morphology. You can see they're just a little, kind of these long stamens and then this little cup of nectar. And as a consequence from comparing museum specimens to today's birds, the bill of the eevee is getting shorter and straighter to switch to this new food source. And really high endemism. So most of the species in Hawaii are found nowhere else on Earth. So it's really a special place. This is the Hawaiian happy face spider, which comes in many different morphs of happy faces, as you can see here. This species was discovered only about 100 years ago, and yet and almost no work has been done on it until quite recently, until the 1970s or so. But yeah, if you walk through Hawaiian rainforests and you flip over leaves, you will find these guys. They're not uncommon. And yet, many of these species have been lost, these endemic species that are so special to Hawaii. 80% of all birds, 30% of all plants, some unknown number of invertebrates. We really don't know what we have, so we don't know what we've lost. Leaving us with, at last count, 317 endangered species for Hawaii alone. That just blows most other states out of the water. It's just a fraction of the U.S. landmass, 0.25%, and yet has by far the most endangered species of any other state, more than California or any other particularly diverse state. So what happened? Lots of things happened. Several waves of human colonization. The Polynesians early on and later the Europeans. And especially with the Europeans, brought in all kinds of species that were not there. So Hawaii has no terrestrial land mammals other than one species of insectivorous bat, the Hawaiian hoary bat. That's it for land mammals. And so when Europeans brought cattle, and cattle moved into the forest, large areas of land were cleared actively for cattle ranching, and then cattle also, by girdling trees and by consuming native seedlings and through the introduction of non-native pasture grasses. As a result, many areas were either deforested or heavily degraded by the introduction of cattle. At one point, Hawaii Island had the third largest cattle ranch in the country. So think of cattle ranches in Texas and other places in the West. They had Parker Ranch, the third largest ranch in the country. And then there's also these guys, the predators. So several different species of rats were introduced accidentally, for the most part through shipping and trade. This rat here is eating a native Hawaiian land snail, which was believed to be the most important food source for the po'uli, that little brown bird on Maui that went extinct just over 10 years ago. So in addition to being a predator of eggs and nestlings, they're also a competitor for the same food. The feral pigs were introduced. European boars were introduced by the Europeans and hybridized with the Polynesian pigs, not native pigs, but pigs that were brought over with the Polynesians, moved into the forest. and create and degrade ecosystems by rototilling the soil, by knocking over tree ferns. So they literally climb up the tree ferns with their front legs, and I've seen them do this, and knock the tree ferns over and dig out the inside of the tree ferns, eating that fleshy interior. And finally, I want to mention a big heat problem for the birds is avian disease, and avian malaria and pox and several others, but especially malaria. So this is an apopani with a non-native mosquito potentially carrying this non-native disease. Birds are very naive to this disease, and so below a certain elevation line above which the mosquitoes and disease system can't persist as well, there's few to no native birds. There's a few species that are potentially developing some resistance, but the rarest birds, there's no signs of any resistance. And so the birds are now largely restricted to higher elevations on all of the islands, say above 4,500 or 5,000 feet, which means on some islands they're being pushed right off the top of the mountain or off the top of the islands. There's some interesting synergies between these things and all three of these things, really, because pigs, by creating these hollows in tree ferns, can create breeding habitat for mosquitoes, thus exacerbating the disease problem. And then because of large-scale clearing of land for cattle ranching, the available habitat that's left for birds is quite limited. It's patchy and limited. And with the prospect of climate change, we're expecting that band between tree line and the disease line, and between the patches of cleared land and the patches of intact forest, to continue to shrink. Okay, so all that's sort of sobering, but I also think that there's tons of potential for conservation and for restoration in particular in Hawaii. I'm going to explain why. So Hawaii is undergoing a lot of land use change right now, and part of that is due to the ranching culture in Hawaii. The economy of ranching is changing. So these old ranching families in Hawaii, and sometimes their offspring are not so much interested in running a ranch. There's also really high, these people are often land rich but cash poor, and Hawaii is, the prices of land, of homes there is very high for second homes, for vacation homes, etc. And so there's a lot of pressure to sell off or subdivide ranches. It's hard to make a living actually running in cattle in Hawaii. You have to ship the cattle live, across the ocean. There's no processing plants in Hawaii. And so because of that, there's several different possible directions this could go. Certainly, these properties could be subdivided and developed into ranchette-style developments, and some of that is already happening. But there's also possibilities to diversify. So if you don't only want to ranch because it's not economically viable, you could do either native or non-native tree forestry. I'm going to talk more about that. And there's also the possibility of restoring portions of your ranch for the other amenities that native forests provide. And I'll talk a bit about that too. So I see these sort of changing patterns of land use and land ownership as opening up new opportunities for conservation and for bird habitat in particular in Hawaii. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So again, going back to this question of how can we conserve threatened species while making conservation profitable, that's going to be critical if we're doing conservation on private land. And this topic is certainly relevant far beyond Hawaii. You can think of the classic cases of the spotted owl and the gray wolf, and in both of these scenarios, when these species in private lands sort of collided, there was fireworks, right? And their futures were often sort of set up as owls versus jobs, or wolves versus sheep farmers and things like that. And so what I've been trying to do in Hawaii is think a little bit differently about this, and think about whether we can approach conservation on private land differently, so there's not conflict but rather synergy. So I'm going to turn now and talk specifically about this one bird, the Akiapola'au, which is one of Hawaii's endangered forest birds. a Hawaiian honey creeper. And this bird has some really interesting natural history. So it's a honey creeper, which means it's a finch, an ancestor of a finch, like a house finch or something like that. And yet it's an example of a situation where this bird acts very much like a woodpecker. So it's sort of the woodpecker of Hawaii. It opens its bill really wide, drills with the lower mandible, and then uses the upper mandible to go in and pull beetle larvae and other larvae from underneath the bark surface. And because it can actually put the tips of its mandibles together and pry things out, as well as drilling, as well as scooping, people often call it the Swiss Army knife bird because of this unique behavior. It's limited to just a few patches. This is an old map now, so these perhaps have shrunk in some places and grown in others, but the black is where it remained as of the 1990s. I haven't seen an updated map, but so you can see the population is fragmented and it's restricted only to this one island. I'm going to just introduce the two dominant canopy tree species in Hawaii because these are going to be relevant as I move forward. The first is ohia, which is this, I mentioned earlier, has these bright red flowers that the EEB are now feeding on for nectar. And the other is koa, an acacia species, and that's really the preferred source of food for the kiapulau. So it forages almost entirely on koa, also using some understory. But one thing that's interesting is that as I started to work in Hawaii, together with another biologist at a national wildlife refuge, we started to see trees just covered in holes, and like this. But they weren't koa trees, the preferred foraging, again, substrate for a kiapulau. They were ohia trees. And so the question is, what's going on here? And it turns out that what a kiapulau are doing is using these trees much like sapsuckers do. See if I can go back. So what the bird here is doing is drilling into the surface of the bark, again with its lower mandible, and then bringing its two mandibles together and using its tongue and that curved part of its bill to have the phloem of the tree flow out through the hole, and it's drinking that sap. So this is a neat example of conversion evolution. And we did a little mini study to ask what's special about these trees, because it's probably about 1 in 1,000 ohia trees that would be covered in holes. Parts or all of the tree would be covered in holes. So we went out and mimicked a kiapulau by drilling just a little nail the same size as an kiapulau bill into ohia trees with holes and without holes. And we found just an order of magnitude higher volume of sap flowing from holes where a kiapulau had drilled in the past. And these trees were not sort of randomly distributed in terms of various characteristics. So they tended to be larger, smoother bark, to be in certain parts of the forest and things like that. But there's still this question about whether a kiapulau are creating this sap flow or whether these trees naturally have higher sap flow and the birds are able to find them and take advantage of this resource. And there's also this question of, are they serving then as ecosystem engineers? Are they opening up opportunities for other birds? We observed many other species of birds, at least 2 other species of birds, also coming in to drink sap from these wells once the kiapulau had left. And whether or not invertebrates use this system, we have no idea. So this is a hot topic for a future inquiry. Okay, so now I want to step back to, again, this other species that kiapulau mostly forage on, koa. And one of the reasons that people have believed that kiapulau are so rare and declining is that they really rely on these old growth forests that, again, are restricted to high elevations, these patchy habitats of intact forest. But again, shortly before I started doing some of my work in Hawaii, kiapulau were found in stands of koa that looked like this. And these stands of koa were created specifically, they were created on private land, and they were created as sort of a forestry experiment, because koa is a very high value native tree species. So the wood has a lot of value potentially, and this is a ranch that was, like I mentioned earlier, trying to diversify. So they pulled cattle out of this portion of the ranch. They bulldozed to scarify the soil, scarify the seeds, which works really well for koa. They came up like they call it dog hair in these stands, really thick stands of koa. And a Keopu'au were in these stands. And so I shaped then a research project around asking whether these young stands of koa, again, being regenerated, being grown on private land, mostly for economic reasons, also for cultural reasons. Koa is important traditionally for Native Hawaiians as well. Could forestry, native tree forestry, contribute to the recovery of this endangered species? So I measured habitat characteristics, foraging preferences, foraging behavior, reproductive success, and home range size and territoriality at sites in old growth forest and in this young koa stand, which I'm just showing there, the 3 different places where we worked. And I'm just going to present some results here specifically about home range size and density of these populations at these sites. So the open forest, and by that I mean big old trees, but relatively open understory because of a history of grazing by cattle and other species. We followed 9 families over 3 or 4 years. These home ranges, which are these sort of squiggly white things, kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. There's not much overlap. They're right up against each other. They seem to be defending their territories here. So given these sizes of home ranges and the way they're oriented, about 100 hectares of this habitat could support 5 pairs of birds. In the closed forest, which is very similar canopy, but much denser understory, less historical disturbance by non-native ungulates, you can see the home range sizes are smaller and there's a bit more overlap. So 10 pairs of birds can be supported in 100 hectares of this type of habitat. And then finally, in the young koa stands, they were 10 to 15 years old at the time that I started working there. There was basically a complete breakdown of territoriality. So you can see all that stippled area is the overlap between these puzzle pieces. If I had worked if I had followed pairs in the areas around here, you could imagine that this entire area could be stippled. So the birds, there appeared to be perhaps no shortage of food in this system, and because of that, males appeared to be defending their females rather than some sort of spatial area. And because of then maybe the richness of this habitat and this sort of lack of territoriality, 13 pairs could be supported on 100 hectares of this type of habitat. We did follow nests at all 3 sites and found no difference in reproductive success, and did find nests within the koa stand, the young stand of koa. So the conclusions for this particular study, we found these young koa stands supported high densities of a Keopu'au, no reproductive cost, and it appears then that these young stands of koa can create quality habitat for this species within a decade. And although restoring mature forest remains a really critical long-term goal for Keopu'au and many other species, in the short term, given the rarity of this bird, there's only about 1,200 individuals remaining, koa reforestation may be one of our best hopes for a Keopu'au recovery. It's something that we can do on public land, but also on private land. Again, keeping that goal in mind of finding ways to align conservation and human livelihoods. And so following on this study, did a series of interviews with people, private landowners, and people in the forest industry and the conservation organizations to understand what the potential would be for this. And the reason for that is this is a piece of koa here. You can see this is a completely flat piece of wood, but it gives this illusion of curl. And this wood is just highly valued. So it's a set of furniture, table and chairs could sell for $10,000 to $12,000. Bowls routinely would sell for $500 to $1,000 of this type of high quality curled koa. And so there's a lot of opportunity, and this is underway for landowners like the one that regenerated that koa stand and others to plant koa as perhaps a legacy, a source of income for their grandchildren, while also providing habitat for biodiversity. And because this tree would be selectively harvested because of the high value of its wood. This is probably not a scenario where you'd come back in 40 years and clear cut a stand and lose all that habitat value. Okay, so young koa provides benefits for Akea pula'au, but what about all of the other birds in this system and the plant community as well? So that's where I want to turn to this second question about what's the potential of large-scale reforestation of koa and other species to provide broad benefits for songbirds. And to do this, we worked across public and private lands on the Kona or windward side of Hawaii, and we looked at 4 different sort of habitat types: open pasture land, which is sort of the status quo for most ranches; wooded pasture, so pasture mixed with trees, so sort of heavily, you could call that either heavily degraded forest or not so great pasture land, something in between. And then koa stands, there are a few other similar stands on other private and public land parcels, and also in native forests, so forests that had been minimally disturbed. And we did surveys for birds and understory plants over the course of several years. And what we found here is that the relationship between the density or abundance of birds and plants was not linear. We had a non-linear relationship with tree cover. And so essentially, as using basal area as a metric of tree cover. So as you increase tree cover, you get this big increase in bird abundance or bird density. So it's just for a relatively small investment in planting trees, you could potentially get a big payoff in terms of supporting the bird community. This, I just want to point out, that's not the case for understory plants. So if conserving understory plant community is a priority, you would want to make different choices in this community. You'd have to make a much bigger investment to restore understory plant diversity and abundance in this system. But based on these results, we worked with NRCS to get a conservation innovation grant to go out and plant islands of koa on large private ranches in Hawaii. So this is us doing some of that work. It was it's actually quite challenging. You've got to fence out the cattle. You've got to spray all these non-native pasture grasses to allow the trees some chance of survival. And so what we did is do this across, again, 3 ranches and use this design where we planted islands of koa, small islands, 3 small islands, and also 1 larger island. So the 3 small islands added up in area to that 1 large island across these 3 sort of replicate ranches. And in between, on each side of the ranch was often a forest that ran what they call it Mauka to Makai, from the ocean up to the mountains. So often that's how like land tenure is structured in Hawaii, is in these long linear sort of strips. And so the question here is, could birds use these first as novel habitat, but also as stepping stones to be able to disperse or move across these big open gaps for which forest birds in Hawaii wouldn't have necessarily evolved with, given the history of a contiguous forest. And so we did this about 5 years ago. The trees grow really rapidly. So this is my collaborator forester, JB Friday. He's like over 6 feet tall. And this was after 4 years of the trees being planted. So that's one really cool thing about koa, is it grows so rapidly. So it can provide habitat potentially in a relatively short period of time, as well as providing these other benefits to landowners. This is an aerial view of one of the ranches and these 4 patches. And so what I'm hoping to do in the next couple of years is to go back and actually assess whether these islands, this island model, and again, the reason that we're doing islands rather than sort of big bands or big patches of planting is to keep in mind that these ranchers need to be able to move their cattle up and down the ranch. So again, this is an attempt to diversify and enhance habitat value to an active ranch rather than sort of replace their current way of making a living. Okay, So I'm going to turn now to the last piece here of the story that I want to tell today, and that's to turn to understory restoration. So I've focused so much on restoring canopy cover for Acacia and also now for other species. This question of how to restore understory plants, that can be really costly and labor intensive once these forests have been heavily degraded. And that made me really interested in, again, the role of birds in restoration. And this interest really arose from working in these kind of wooded pasture type systems. Some of these ungulates had been removed, cattle, pigs, other non-native mammals had been removed years previous, and yet we saw very little regeneration in these areas. And so the question is, what's limiting regeneration of native plants in this area? And you can imagine that it could be several different things. It could be a lack of seed source, it could be lack of dispersal, it could be something inhibiting germination or survival of these seedlings. And for the purposes of this talk and the work that we did, I'm focusing specifically on this seed dispersal, stage. Given that there weren't a shortage of seed sources in this system, there are understory plants in these patches. They just don't seem to be spreading out. And the reason we thought seed dispersal might be limited in this system is that 50% of all of Hawaii's native plants rely on seed dispersal by birds. And yet we only have 3 native dispersers, vertebrate dispersers left in Hawaii. The puaiohi, which is restricted to about 500 birds on the island of Kauai, critically endangered species. The oma'o, which is still relatively common but restricted to half of its original range on the Big Island. And the alala, which is the native crow, which is extinct in the wild, but there's a captive population. Some islands have lost all of their frugivores. And yet, many non-native species have been introduced to Hawaii, like the Japanese white-eye, which is shown here. You can see the sort of purplish tinge above its beak and around its eye ring. That's from the native Hawaiian raspberry, these sort of big, juicy raspberries. Clearly, this guy has been taking advantage of that native source of food. So the question is, in part, could these non-native omnivorous or frugivorous birds like white-eyes, could they be replacing the services, the seed dispersal services lost by the decline and extinction of native frugivores? Or is the fact that these native birds are gone or largely gone from huge parts of the state and replaced by non-native birds changing the composition of Hawaii's plant communities? We have asked this question for puaiohi and for oma'o. I'm not going to talk about that work today. But we have found that it seems to be that the non-native frugivores are dispersing seeds, often of many of the same species, but really disproportionately. So mostly small-seeded species, mostly common species, and also exotic species. So they seem to be imperfect replacements for native frugivores. But again, today what I'd like to focus on is the alala, or the Hawaiian crow. Again, this bird is extinct in the wild, but there's a growing captive population. And the neat thing about the alala is that it's by far the largest frugivore in Hawaii. So compared to the oma'o, which I just discussed, that's the one that's still common on the Big Island, or these 2 non-native birds, it's much, much larger. So it potentially has the capacity to disperse a much larger array of seed and fruit sizes compared to these birds. So in the absence of the alala, it's possible that many plants in Hawaii are simply not being dispersed at all, at least via vertebrates. And we all know when fruit and seeds fall close to the tree that there's disadvantages for the survival of those seedlings. They have to compete with the native plant, the parent plant. And so we asked, how might alala have shaped and may shape again Hawaii's plant community? So what's been lost in the absence of the alala, and what could the recovery and reintroduction of the alala do in terms of seed dispersal in Hawaii? So we worked with this captive population, and what we did was a series of captive feeding trials, basically, where we provided them with an array of fruit choices inside the aviaries on the Big Island of Hawaii near a volcano. And we provided them with an array of food choices, and then we watched to see, this is mostly the work of my graduate student, Susan Culleney, watched to see where they moved those fruits. So did they consume the fruits? Did they carry the fruits? And did they cache the fruits? So that's something that Alala, like many other birds, do, is shove the fruits into little corners of their aviary. So these could be seen as 3 different forms of dispersal. Certainly consumption, the idea that they're going to fly somewhere else and defecate. Carrying, moving the fruit beyond, away from the parent plant, in quotation marks, since they're just lying on a log in their cage. Or caching, which I'll talk a little bit more later about what the implications of that could be. And then the way that we looked at this was both through direct observations, but also by putting out sort of trays to capture fecal material to look at what seeds actually pass through their gut. And then also they, like owls and other species, also regurgitate undigestible material. So they regurgitate pellets, and we also collected those. And then did a germination trial experiment in a greenhouse to look at if there was some advantage for the seed passing through the gut of the bird or being regurgitated in the pellet form, compared to planting whole seeds, which in the absence of the alala may well be what's going on in the wild today in Hawaii, as seeds are simply falling to the ground whole. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about a few results here. The first is dispersal. So this is just the probability that the bird, that the flock as a whole are eating these fruits. We did many replicate trials, and the 2 different color bars here, the black refer to more older alala, so at least over 3 years, and then the lighter bars refer to younger alala in the flock. And because birds were often kept, more than one bird was in a aviary, we weren't able to look at individuals, but rather groups of birds often. But usually older and younger birds were kept separately. And so what you can see here is that as a flock, and both older and younger birds consumed every single thing we gave them. So they were not picky. They ate everything we gave them. This is the first time they had been exposed to native fruits. The birds that were born in captivity, they're typically fed things like eggs and dead mice and papaya. So this is potentially a new thing for them, for the birds born in captivity, and they ate every single thing. And I'm not going to show you the results for carrying, but they also carried every single thing. So they consumed everything, they moved everything, and they also cached everything. So in all cases, they would take these things, fly up into some corner of the aviary, and shove it in a little corner for later, presumably. And the neat thing about this, although they're caching at, these are a little hard to read, they're caching at low, the percentage time that they're caching these fruits is low, we've seen 1 in 4%, but yet this in the wild may be really important. So I've already talked already about the non-native species that have been introduced to Hawaii. Some of those are herbivores, some of them are seed predators on the ground. It's difficult for plants to germinate on the ground. But yet a lot of things grow epiphytically. So it's possible that by alala, if they do the same thing in the wild and they're cramming fruits into little corners of tree branches, that there's actually a decent chance that the germination success up in the canopy may be higher than on the ground in many of these degraded and disturbed sites. So that was kind of interesting. In terms of germination success, I'm going to show you 6 species here for which we are able to do enough. We got enough seeds from the fecal samples that we were able to do the trials. What we did is we also, in addition to planting seeds from fecal samples that pass through the bird and the whole seeds and the pellets in some cases, we also actively cleaned the seeds ourselves and planted them to see if it was mostly just the removing of the fruit that provided the benefit, or if there was something else additional, special to passing through the gut that provided the benefit. And what you'll see is that in many cases here, not all, but in many cases, the cleaned and the fecal and the pellet, seeds that passed through the bird in some form or were clean, had significantly higher germination success than the plants for which we just planted the seeds whole. I want to draw your attention to this species in particular, Huava. This is a relatively large fruited and seeded plant, for which what you see here is rats, which have broken into the capsule and eaten the fruit, and that's mostly what you see on the ground. From talking to botanists in Hawaii, they say almost no natural regeneration of this species in the wild. And one reason maybe is that when we planted whole Huava, relative to the seeds that had passed to the bird, we saw zero germination. So it's possible that in the absence of the alala, these seeds are too large for the other dispersed vertebrates that are out there, these smaller birds, that there's just no dispersal occurring and very little regeneration because they're not having the opportunity to pass through the bird. So to kind of summarize this part of the talk, alala dispersed seeds of all of the plant species we provided them. Some of these were known from historical records to have been dispersed by alala. Others were not. We had to get all kinds of crazy special permission to feed them things that they were never known to have eaten before, things like lolu, native palms, which were outside of the range of the last remnant populations. And they dispersed those as well. So the neat thing about this, again, is this captive population. This is a tiny little baby alala born in captivity. They've been really successful at building this captive population to the point where coming this fall, actually, any day now, there's a planned release. So they're planning to release a population of these birds back into the wild. And this provides, I think, a tremendous opportunity to look at the degree to which restoring a species like this could catalyze the recovery of a forest bird community. And one last point I'll make is that we're asking some similar questions in New Zealand, in New Zealand's fenced mainland island sanctuaries, about when you remove the predators from these systems, are bird populations recovering? And if so, there's some evidence that they are. What are the cascading consequences for seed dispersal? So rather than asking what's lost when birds are lost, we're asking what's regained as bird populations recover and are actively reintroduced to these really special places in New Zealand. So that's my PhD student Sarah Bambachi's work, and she's actively doing this field work right now. So with that, I'll just say again, my hope is that we can find ways to combine, field ecology or ecological approaches with economic and social value to find ways to make conservation more commonplace, both in places like Hawaii, but also much more broadly in the landscapes that we care about. So with that, I'll acknowledge the many sources of funding, the field assistance, landowners, collaborators, including graduate students and other collaborators inside and outside Hawaii, and also the famous Jack Jeffrey for pretty much all of the bird photographs in the talk. And thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. All right. Yes.
So it's very exciting to hear about the alala planned reintroduction. Do you know of any stakeholders that wouldn't be happy about that in Hawaii, or is it generally like a positive outlook on that?
Yeah, it's complicated for sure because of I didn't talk about the history of the alala. So there was another release that occurred. So I put a very positive spin on it here. There was another release that occurred in the late 90s, early 2000s that was actually unsuccessful. And it was unsuccessful probably for a variety of reasons, but several of those that are known. One is that the birds were really naive to predation from Hawaiian hawks. So they were sort of like go and make their raucous calls. These birds are super charismatic and cool. And they go make their raucous calls on the top of the canopy. And EO, the hawks, would just come in and pick them right off. And these are also federally listed endangered species, so you don't have the option of just simply moving the EO or removing the EO. And then the other problem is that they were attracted to or interacted with cat feces that carried toxoplasmosis, and so many birds that were released died of toxoplasmosis that's spread by feral cats in the system. And then the other problem is that a lot of this happened on a private ranch, which was the last, and adjacent state land, but that was the last vestige of habitat for Alala before they went extinct. And there was just all kinds of politics there. There's a lot of distrust between, in the end, a lot of distrust between the private landowner and the state and federal agencies that are running the release. They picked a different site for the release, but I think even among the biologists, there's probably some disagreement as to exactly how to implement this. Among the broader public, my guess is that there's mostly support for this for the people that are aware of it. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just saying, there's a really good book on it's called The Sacred Raven. I can't remember the author, about the whole I can't remember when, it came out 10 years ago or so, so these last years of more success aren't so much in there, but the original sort of brouhaha over what to do with them and how to get them into captivity. So, cool.
Yeah, please.
How open are the ranching community to sort of diversifying their land use? Is that, I mean, sort of like going along the same lines as a question, like how are they okay with the reforestation for the most part, or is that, do you have a lot of opposition to that as well?
I mean, I think it's probably somewhat variable, but all of the 3 ranchers that we approached with this concept of planting these islands of koa on their land were really receptive to that, and allowed us to move forward in partnership with them, and they're continuing to maintain the fences and these stands of koa. I think often these landowners are risk averse for reasons you can understand. Like what they know how to do often is to raise cattle, and to do these other things can be less comfortable. But I think they're all increasingly recognizing the importance of diversifying their income streams to support their family, their broader families, whether that's tourism or whether that's some form of forestry. I think there's more acceptance of that than there was in the past.
That's really good to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for that interesting talk. A question kind of following up on that is, do you get concerns, I guess, from the private landowners about creating habitat, given that there's so many endangered species out there that they may be creating an encumbrance to themselves and attracting species?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the place where I talked about that koa was regenerating and Akiapola'a were doing really well, they actually did a safe harbor agreement with the federal government to protect them, because they're continuing. They've now pulled cattle off of most of that property and are doing a lot more reforestation. They also happen to be a private landowner that's really invested in education and success of the Native Hawaiian community. And so planting koa is very much consistent with their cultural mission and educational mission, as well as their need to make a living from the land. But in order to give them the protection to go ahead and do that, because they're pretty much guaranteed to have, I hope, increased populations of Akiapola'a and also several other federally listed species. So they've entered into safe harbor agreements. Others are pursuing the same or have done the same, or candidate conservation agreements in some cases. So yeah, there is concern about that. And I have been told by landowners in the past doing some of these bird surveys and such that they to be careful about how I'm reporting my information. Yeah, so they would rather that there not necessarily be endangered species on their properties in some cases, because they're concerned about restrictions. Yeah.
So is there any sort of attempt to quantify broader public value associated with these birds? your work is great of trying to bring in those social values of the COA and the restoration that the landowner, the monetary value that landowners can get out of that effort, I guess, to grow COA as a harvested species. Is there any effort to sort of quantify or capture how the broader Hawaiian people or the people that live out there feel about the birds, and do they have pride in the fact that these are native species that don't live anywhere else, or is there any sort of...
No, that's great. And I don't know, actually, I don't know if Chris knows of any research specifically on that, on people's perceptions of birds. I do know, I was involved in a project where they went out and did focus groups, and there was very little knowledge or understanding of native birds in Hawaii. And I think part of the problem, so I see a big contrast between Hawaii and New Zealand, for example, where in New Zealand, like the native birds are literally on their money. Like their currency has the native birds on their money, instead of like old, white dead presidents or whatever, and you go in a coffee shop and there's big pictures of their native birds. Like it's very much integrated into their culture. They actually just did something, you may have heard about this, like that's just crazy. The Prime Minister just announced by 2050, the entire country will be predator free. And they're investing millions, many millions of dollars into this, not just for nature, but with the recognition that it has that these species have economic costs. So they're doing this for people and for nature. Hawaii is just not there yet. So, and part of the problem is that there's a physical disconnect between where people live in Hawaii and where the last native species are. So many of the places people live, they only see non-native, 98% of the species they see are not native, and yet are seen as sort of Hawaiian now, right? Like, and it's beautiful. But they don't have access often for socioeconomic reasons or just because of where these places are to Hawaii's sort of natural heritage. And because of the legacy of how people treated Native Hawaiians, there's a gap in how information was passed down through the generations, because certainly these places and these species used to be very highly valued. Yeah. Are there questions?
Sounds like you need a cat expert in Hawaii.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.